Well, we've just been looking at the eastern settlement and the middle settlement. The middle settlement is often regarded as an extension to the eastern settlement, but myself and Ed, who've done the work there, think that it has really rather more characteristics of the western settlement, and that's where we're moving on to now. There's the western settlement, and that's a jumping off point, if you like, for the northern hunting grounds, the Nordseta of the Norse. There's also the question of Vinland and Lonso Meadows, which we will also address briefly during the course of the lecture. So the Western settlement. This gives you an idea of what the Western settlement is like. But at the same time, the Norse may be living close to the ice areas, really the inner fjord areas, but there's also, at the same time, people have been living in the outer areas of that archipelago. And what I'd like to do, just by way of contrast, is to show you what kind of pattern we see in some of the evidence from an Inuit area. And this is the site of Kaniak. And I will then be looking at a nearby settlement called, well, not nearby, it's a good few hours away, of Anavik, a Norse one. And this is Kaniak, and this is us approaching an Inuit site that's long been abandoned, as you can see. And here we are pulling up our material in order to carry out our sampling work. And this gives you an idea of you could stay in the buildings if you wanted to, I guess, but it was somewhat easier to camp. And of interest to us were the fact that there were middens in the eroding coastal sections around the island. And also a mire, a peat bog, on the edges of which we were camping. And there's our pollen site. And if we look at the pollen, we see that we're at the tail end, perhaps, or even the Norse period has ended as far as this area is concerned. You can see very constrained dates there. But what we have all the way through that, and this is a big contrast to what you see in the Norse sites in the eastern settlement, is we've still got microscopic charcoal going on beyond the period of settlement, which would have been continuing in effect below the level. We didn't have the peaks, but below this level, there was clearly Norse activity from the dates from elsewhere going on over a very long period at the site. And what we also have at the end here is quite a lot of scrubland, and also the weed communities are far, far less in evidence to what one would find even post-Norse in the Norse areas. And here we have the dung spores, but these would not be from Norse animals or surviving animals, but probably from caribou. And we see reductions in here in the shrub component at the same time as one taxon, which we don't see in our inland areas, and that's Icelandic purslane, or Coenigia icelandica, which is very famous as a late glacial weed, not weed, a late glacial taxon in a Scottish environment, for example. And if we look at the sites themselves, we can look at the eroding face, and absolutely jam-packed, full of bone and wood and other implements. And if you look at the radiocarbon dates here, these are from 1300 to 1400, for example. In this section, the Inuit were around in this coastal area. And also the midden deposits are dominated by algae feeders and so on, totally different from the anthropogenic taxa that one sees associated with livestock and Norse occupation in the inner fjord areas. And also sitting on the eroding out of the sites and sitting on the beach, one can find steatite material which have presumably been traded by the Norse with the Inuit, and also pegs which could have been used for harpoon work or for anything at all associated with the Inuit way of life, and even the handle of an ulu, which is the woman's knife. And this picture by a very famous artist who came from that area before it was depopulated, Aaron of Kaniak, produced these amazing pictures, and this is one of caribou being hunted. Whether this was the same method used by the Norse, we don't know. We know virtually nothing about the hunting of reindeer by the Norse in Greenland or how they did it. But if we go from Kaniak up to Anavik, then we're going to one of the largest settlements in the Western settlement, and indeed in Greenland. And this is the view from the Norse site. This is us being landed and thinking, what the hell do we do now? Where do we go? Where is the site? You have to remember that in the middle settlement and in the Western settlement, so much is just covered with willow scrub. And finding your way around can be an absolute nightmare, but we obviously did find our way. We have to contend with mosquitoes and black fly, with Arctic foxes that decide they want to eat our water containers. But if you've got an Andy McMullen with you who will go out fishing, then you've got fresh food every day if you want it. And it can be very hot there, and there's Ed Schofield cooling himself off. Another problem that one faces is frozen ground. So you've got your site, and you start to dig, and it's not quite like permafrost, which is, as we'll see in a moment, is permanently frozen, but this is ground that you have to wait to defrost. Maybe you have to wait half a day, maybe you have to wait 2 days, and maybe you'll go down 10 centimeters at a time, maybe you'll go down 1 centimeter at a time. But it is a problem when you hit what's with your spade and suddenly you think you've hit concrete. And you can imagine it takes time then in order to extract, let's say, peat, from which you hope to get information from pollen and from insects and from the minerogenic component of those Maya deposits. This is what you would have to do if it's real permafrost, is to use a jackhammer to go through this material, but we didn't have to do that on this occasion. The site of Anavik has got a house, a very large church, the byre, and a store. It's magnificent. This is the most substantial building in the Western settlement. And this was a site that Owe Roussel was in charge of excavating. And there is a pollen site. And this is the site that was investigated by Johannes Iversen, the author, one half of the authorship of the famous first real textbook of pollen analysis, the book by Fagrian Iversen, a Dane, and he had always worked on, had looked at climate change and woodland history, was the first person to demonstrate Neolithic impacts on vegetation in Northwest Europe, and here he was using similar methods to look at the Norse in Greenland. And here's his site. Sorry, here is a pollen diagram from his site at Anavik. And he has a level in here with charcoal and wood chips, with birch declining across this horizon. And on the right-hand side, We have rumex, this weed of agriculture, increasing. But the thing to note is that his sampling interval is at 4 centimeters. So it's not very fine resolution. Landnam, the settlement period, is indicated to him by this combination of pollen and charcoal. Obviously, no dates. This is 1934. Radiocarbon dating hadn't been invented by Libby as yet. And this was also a key site in the argument that shrub clearance at Landnam was by fire. And you see this 1934 paper still cited in support of that. But we thought it would be very important to resample this site, which is what we've done. And this is a simplified diagram work with Ed Schofield on that site. This is contiguous 1 centimeter samples, so that, as I explained with serial pollen optimization, we don't have any gaps, we're not missing anything. So we're just doing a continuous profile all the way through. And Landnam is down here. And here we've got changes in pollen, changes in these dung spores. And we've got the charcoal horizon actually coming in up there, somewhat later. So there's a gap, a very substantial gap. We saw this at Tasiusak, we're seeing it here. Fire was not used for shrub clearance at Landnam. And so this idea, I think, now has to go. And it has to go, I think this would apply to most of the sites that we've been looking at in Greenland. And there is erosion indicated by the loss on ignition curve, which could well be an indication of the Little Ice Age. Fire may have been used in some very small way within the home field, but we haven't found evidence for it. But Jens Rosing, in one of his pictures, at least produces a very nice image of what supposedly did happen, but we're sure did not. Furthermore, at Anavik, it's not just pollen, of course. There's a pollen monolith, but also insects, and also a transect with a lot of soil pits along it. And Eva Panayotopoulou's work on insect remains from Everson's bog, the same mire that we were dealing with, certainly has remains indicative of human impact. But, and this was one of the arguments that was used by Everson and others since, no evidence, no pupae that he and others had identified as indicating the presence of caterpillars which would live on the foliage, particularly of willow, and absolutely decimate, and this has been seen in historical times, just decimate an area around a farm, so that you remove, let's say, all the potential leaf foddering material for animals, as well as it being unpleasant. We don't find any signs of the caterpillar here, and therefore it's presumably a victim of the drying of the mire. I'm not saying this is modern greenhouse warming. I'm not giving an explanation as to why this would be, but we don't have any survival of that evidence at the site. And this was the site, apart from fire, this was the site that was being used to justify that argument. The soils by Sterling indicate a very nice Landnam surface, a buried land surface there, together with enhancement of the soils above. Once again, the same kind of pattern that we've seen right across the North Atlantic, not just in Greenland. And the radiocarbon dates from charcoal within the soils, all fitting between about 1000 and 1400 AD, just entirely consistent with what one's finding elsewhere. And the occupation had certainly commenced by the 11th century, so it had commenced probably at about the same time as it was happening in the eastern settlement. Although you're a few days further sailing beyond the prime fertile area of the eastern settlement, then this was still seen as desirable, perhaps because, of course, it's a major stepping stone towards the economic glory of those walrus hunting grounds of the Nordsetter beyond the western settlement. If we move from Anavik down to a famous site, Gardenundesanet, which is generally called Goose. It's the farm beneath the sand. And here the area, the whole farmstead really was being flooded, and hence the need to excavate. But you can see the site, it's not fully published yet, we hope not too far away, but it's under excavation here. And once again, the inset work with evidence for human flea, human louse, and sheep biting louse as well, so sharing the misery. And here we see peat walls, sheep pellets, and burning. There's a whole series of phases of this settlement, as well as a willow basket. And you can see here for Goose, we have burning and abandonment, a whole series of abandonment phases in that one dwelling, for example. Recent evidence by a whole series of geneticists, but including our colleague Jeder Arneborg, looking at the DNA of the soils on this site. And this is looking at a core from here, just beyond the building remains, a soil core from the home field. And this was sequenced for ancient mitochondrial DNA. And interestingly, one gets quite a lot of taxa that one would expect to be there and supported by the bone evidence anyway. Through time, we can ignore this. That was all human and recent contamination. But apart from that, one has signs, as you can see, of reindeer, as well as humans and sheep, goats, cattle, the whole lot varying through time. This has been done in very few sites. It's not high resolution, but I think it's very exciting. Even the mouse. And close to Goose is another site, Nippertsok. And this site has been investigated by Eva and research colleagues on the paleoentomology. And here is a site under excavation, and it's a complicated site, as you can see here, with inferences about what those rooms happen to be. This is one of the centralized houses that one finds here, often assumed to indicate a cooling climate and the need to gather people and animals together for increasing warmth. So later stage rather than an early stage settlement. In the larder area, one found the remains of 5 cattle, ptarmigan, Arctic hare. If they're eating ptarmigan and Arctic hare particularly, then things are getting a little bit tough probably. And if the cattle are being eaten, then that could be dire. The fact that all the remains are being found in the larder rather than outside in the midden areas. The dog. Was this their last dog? Here, outside the bedroom. And the insects, such as a very large number of Telemarina flavipes, which are interpreted as being more similar to a latrine than living quarters. This is an indication of a farm under stress. And in here, Scoliocentra fraterna. this is the kind that might live on rotting corpses of either people or bodies or whatever. But no bodies were found at the farm or on any abandoned farm in Greenland. The assumption is that there were still people around here who were able to bury the dead. Let's look at the valley that leads from there up to the ice cap, the inland ice, Östermanedalen. And here one finds, or Roussel found, for example, what he takes to be some kind of bathhouse or sauna. Shoe lasts. And here, this wonderful crucifix found beneath a bench in one of the abandoned dwellings. I told you they get more complex. At least 21 rooms in this particular house, V53D. That gives you a simplified impression of what it might have been like in there, with animals, with people, and so on. And it was presumably covered in wood and turf, particularly turf, and perhaps its look would have been somewhat like that of the reconstruction at Stern that we saw when we discussed Thorsadala in Iceland. Well, we have the Nordsetter, the hunting grounds further north. But in fact, things almost just begin at the hunting grounds. If we move up to the Disco Bay area, to what is seen as the central area for walrus hunting, one also finds this runestone, very small runestone, that was sitting in a cairn, and well, you can read the inscription for yourself. Further north, much further north than most people really think of when they think of the Norse, and there's a close-up map of that, up towards Ellesmere Island, we have cairns, which are not the kind of thing that the Inuit would normally construct, and they certainly didn't know about eider duck shelters. And on this island here, Skraeling Island, we have a carpenter's plane, woodwork, chainmail, and woven material. I'm not saying the Norse were living there, but the Inuit had obviously acquired this either because they'd taken it from abandoned settlements or they'd traded it or whatever, even worse perhaps. If we go to Baffin Island, tally sticks, schist hones, Arctic hare cordage. These are typically associated with the Norse in Greenland. Let's go beyond that and consider the excursions of, well, if you believe the sagas, the son of Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, towards the west coast, where it's assumed that people would certainly have wanted to know and investigate Markland because of the wood resources, the timber resources that would be of use for both houses and for boats. And also the whole question of Vinland, which may be wineland, it may actually mean pasture land. But the whole exploration of that area around Newfoundland and into the St. Lawrence Seaway. And there is, of course, a site known, a famous site at Lonceau Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. And here we are, first suggested by an American antiquarian and journalist, Elliot Cabot, that if you're looking for Vinland, you should be looking along the coastal areas of the Straits of Belle Isle. And then a local journalist and newspaper proprietor from Newfoundland said, no, the place to look is Lonso Meadows. He was looking particularly at the saga evidence and the topography and what was being described. And he also suggested that one should look around Pistole Bay. The Finnish geographer Väinö Tanner said, no, Vinland is the whole of this northern peninsula of Newfoundland. And the Danish archaeologist Jorn Melgaard looked around the whole of this coast here, and in fact settled on Pistole Bay as a place to investigate. And then we meet him again, Helge Ingstad, having dealt with irrigation and been around all of Greenland, decides to go and look for Vinland in many areas, but including this part of Newfoundland. So here he is in his fur trapping days. Remember, he started off life as a lawyer, but there we go. There he is on the plain, as you remember, in his book. And there he is with his wife, Hanna-Stina Ingstad. She's the archaeologist. He was the person who decided where things could happen and should happen. And he suggested to her, having talked to both Jorn Melgaard, who said, this is the area to look, and then he actually went and talked to the locals on the ground and said, are there any humps and bumps that are interesting? And a local man from Lonso Meadows said, over here there are some old Indian, some depressions in the ground that are related or thought to be related to Indian activity. And he decided that this is where Hanna-Stina might like to begin excavating. And the excavation work was continued by Birgitta Wallis, and out of this also came another book by Helge Ingstad, very famous book, Westland to Vinland. Well, this is the site at Lonso Meadows. And here's a close-up of this arc at the head of the bay. And here are ruin-type features which are very similar to anything you would find in the Scandinavian areas of the North Atlantic. And this gives you an idea of what was found. So we have these halls, we have workshops, we have drying houses, we have a smithy. We also have these kinds of finds. Notice also the butternut. This must have come from further south. This raises the question of, is this Vinland or is this a staging post to Vinland? Butternuts grow further south around the St. Lawrence Seaway. If there were vines or wild grapes, they would have come further south still, even as far south as New York. But that's an unknown at the moment. But apart from that, we also have the spruce root ropes, and you may recall the juniper ropes that we saw at Toftaness. And also wonderful things like this. Look at this birch bark cup, sewn with spruce roots. And here's a reconstruction of the site at Lonso Meadows. 148 radiocarbon dates. This is just a selection. More dates on this site than any other archaeological site in Canada. And many of the dates are on wood that turned out to be old, the same problem that we were seeing in Iceland, for example, and these have to be disregarded. But the dates on the most reliable materials were coming out round about 1000 AD. Now remember that the Norse would have arrived in Greenland at 985 AD. So this is rather interesting. That would indicate that people were then moving on very rapidly, at least to have a look in this area. And here is a paper which looks more closely at the dates and suggests that they really cluster within the period 1000 to 1018 AD. The understanding is that probably this site was in either continuous or intermittent occupation for perhaps no more than 2 decades, maybe 1 decade. Many would regard this as simply a staging post for people investigating areas further south. And it's a good staging post, like Herjolfsnes in Greenland, which is almost the first point of land when you're looking for Greenland. This is out on a peninsula. There's an island beyond it. If you're looking for landmarks, this is where you would actually set up shop for your staging post and then moving on further south. But people didn't stay around. And here we have another one of Jens Rosing's pictures of the Skraeling, the indigenous people in that part of Canada, attacking the Norse, and lots of this in the saga of the Greenlanders, for example, and in the Greenlandinger saga, Eric the Red saga. We've got 2 sagas that cover this period. And it obviously, if this is true, was not a conducive environment to really set up shop unless you're really you've got enough people and you're prepared to have a battle with them. Well, there was an end to North Greenland. And this is particularly dramatized in Jared Diamond's book Collapse. And he talks of things, for example, about soil erosion, problems with the Norse, that they wouldn't eat fish, and other things that the Inuit would eat, supposedly, climate change, oppressive elites. Here they're talking particularly about the English and the Portuguese mariners and trying to gain control of the fish trade in the Northwest Atlantic. Let's look at some of this. Let's look down in the eastern settlement at Vatnajökull, this erosion question, which really held sway with a lot of people, that the soils became so impoverished that people just left. Well, there's a whole settlement underneath this blown sand. I mean, yes, it's true. There is a lot of blown sand in certain locations. You can actually go almost around the corner from this, and you don't find this at all. But in certain areas, yes. There's Andy McMullen standing beside this Aeolian sand. And sheep, of course, adding to the erosion that one would find in such environments. And one can investigate that, as Ingrid Mainland has looked at how much the wear on the teeth of sheep has changed through time during the course of the settlement. And so she's able to show how, although they may be eating leafy hay and cereals, and there was low abrasion sometimes, at other times there was very high abrasion. And that clearly this was not necessarily very enjoyable for the sheep, but it's no indication that they would suddenly stop sheep farming. It's just that there's more abrasion on the teeth of the sheep. So, but it's indicating that yes, there is probably increasing erosion and increasing aerial inputs of minerogenic materials. And if you look at the archaeological materials there, they especially have lots and lots of sheep teeth with severe abrasion. So yes, high levels of ingestion of this material and potential overgrazing, but one doesn't know the extent to which that is or was fatal. A site overlooking Garda. Garda, the Bishopsea, is on the top left-hand side there. This is a site investigated by a French group of paleoecologists. And here we can see in this diagram, this is the start of the Norse period. We have erosion indicated by minerogenic materials. We have an increase in grazing from the pollen and a reduction in woodland. And then towards the end of activities here, we also have a phase when these things start to go in decline. But those authors prefer to see this as a phase of conservation, that things were getting tough and people realised this, and so they start to rein back on the intensity of the agriculture. So it's just a different way of looking at it, not seeing it as you're not continuing until the bitter end, worsening the situation. Do something about it. And they're suggesting that's what's happened here, as indeed we had at another site at the top of Eric's Fjord. No signs anywhere of the caterpillars and decimation, so we can get rid of that one probably right away. There was certainly a loss of contact with the Greenland colonies, and the documentary evidence becomes much more scattered and, as far as one can tell, unreliable. And the last records relate to a wedding, what's become, certainly for Greenlanders and for Norse scholars, this iconic wedding at Valsøy Church in 1408, recorded in the Icelandic annals and the baptismal certificate in the Vatican, preceded by a witch burning, when some visiting Icelander, I believe, decided that he would have a relationship with an existing Greenlandic Norse woman. Didn't go down well. When Ívar Bárdarson, a visitor from Norway, arrived, he visited the Western settlement and said that around 1350 it was deserted. And he thought he was there to lead an expedition to drive away the Skraelings. He found no one except the animals that they then proceeded to kill, the animals surviving. And of course sheep particularly can survive for many decades, if not forever, in some of these areas. He said that this was his interpretation, that the Skraelings have destroyed the Western settlements. But many people doubt that he ever went there. And also that if he did, that if he's writing this, it was on very unreliable reports from others. He had a religious agenda. Down around Sandhauen, as we've seen, we have the Inuit occupying the area probably at the same time as the Norse. Conflict with Inuit, however, is there in Inuit folk tales to a degree. And it does talk about encounters and the burning of Valsøy Church. We've done pollen work around there. We've found no evidence for burning at the time when this would have been in occupation. And the annals talk about Skraelings attacking Greenlanders and killing these men and taking boys into slavery. If you talk to many of the Inuit today, they doubt many of these stories at all, and that these were stories that were being told to people because they were being asked leading questions about the relationship between the Inuit and the Norse, and many Inuit disbelieved them. But who knows? It perhaps would be a bit surprising if there wasn't some tension because of the Inuit perhaps in some places conflicting with the Norse over the reindeer migration paths, over the availability of seals, or what have you. We just don't know. The evidence is not there. And the whole question of the decline of the trade in the demand from Europe for ivory, and this is established, and the point is, of course, that the ivory was being obtained from elephants and other animals from Africa, from Asia, and there was a decline, but it didn't actually really stop, which many people seem to overlook. But there does seem to be a reduction in demand for Greenlandic ivory anyway. And then the impact of climate change goes into this mix. And there is no doubt that we had encroaching ice, certainly as we move into the Little Ice Age. Pack ice is moving south, drift ice moving south. This could be altering the migration routes of animals and difficulties for people hunting seals. And of course, if you want to maintain connections with home, you're going to find that quite difficult if instead of being able to go every year, perhaps the areas you can only get out every 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, then perhaps you start to feel somewhat beleaguered if it's important to you. And also differences supposedly in seal hunting techniques and the flexibility that the Norse are not wanting to adopt the kind of practices and that the Inuits were doing. The Norse, to the best of our knowledge, didn't use kayaks, for example, or types of harpoon which would enable them to go after certain types of seal. And there is no doubt that everything became more marine in terms of diet, but people survived in that. That's not a problem. The Inuit can do that. Indeed, there is a suggestion that that is not a problem because they could get this material in trade from the so-called pirates or people who were from Europe who were moving into the area and enlisting the help of locals as a staging post at least for visiting areas, fishing areas to the north and the west. The other one you read about is physical degeneration. There we are. We were told in 24, a race of small people with little strength, physically weakened and with many defects and pathological conditions. And Niels Linnerup says that in fact, when you look at this, apart from some small changes, there are no significant skeletal differences between the time periods. Paleo Demography. Okay, we had plagues in Europe and in Iceland at these times. We have climate stresses, things are becoming harsher. Did people assimilate? Was there but the point is, if they did, we're not seeing signs of this in the archaeological evidence. There is a lack of material in the abandoned settlements, and the Edda-Arneborg would say that this would suggest that there was an orderly migration away from Greenland if that occurred. Niels Linnerup says that if you've got an emigration rate of 10 per year, then over a 200-year period you could depopulate the settlements of 2,000 to 2,500 people. And that this would hardly be noticed if these people then moved, let's say, back into Iceland or whatever. Intermarriage. If you look at the genetics, the mitochondrial DNA shows no trace of female admixture between the Norse, other than in recent times with the indigenous peoples. If you look at the Y chromosome DNA, then the indication is that there is an admixture, but that this is recent and down to colonists from Denmark and Norway in the 18th century. Part of what was called in this paper the sexual politics of colonial activity, but not something that would appear to have been taken place during the Norse period. The historian Kirsten Siever, I think, has produced some of the most thoughtful work on the Norse settlement and its end, and she says that there's no evidence that the Greenlanders had less ability to cope than anyone else. It suggests, once again, that we had orderly withdrawal, that it was non-violent, voluntary, but that the English controlled the stockfish trade in the northwest Atlantic, and that this could have then resulted in a decline in the traditional agriculture, Nordic agriculture in Greenland, and that not quite that they forgot how to farm, but they perhaps didn't need to farm because they were getting supplies from elsewhere. And this, we know, happened to a degree in Iceland, where at one stage here, as a result of their trading in with the Hanseatic League, they were starting to import butter into Iceland. And she suggests that in fact what happened is that the Norse simply left and perhaps relocated in the Labrador area. And that there's no documentary evidence in either Iceland, where she's sure it would have been noted, or in, for example, England, of people from Greenland moving into those areas. Most recently, we have a paper that tries to bring a number of things together by the group led here by Andy Dugmore, which tries to mesh the natural environment and traditional ecological knowledge, published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in America. And once again, though, looks very much at some of the things that have been looked at in a number of publications, including the impact on climate of volcanic activity, changes to diet, and climate change. And they say that the failure was an inability to broaden ecological knowledge bases, that the Norse were too specialised, too small a group, too isolated. Back in 1992, Tom McGovern said it seems probable that all the models advanced are at least partly correct. And most recently, Elsa Østegård says there are no bounds to the imaginative explanations. There are few facts. Hans Egede visited in the 18th century, and he was known as the Apostle of Greenland. He wanted permission to come and proselytize and perhaps to see what happened to the Norse, but he was more concerned about the souls of the Greenlanders. He said there are no Norse or Europeans, only wild people. Interestingly, he had to be somewhat inventive when it came to things like the Lord's Prayer. So the words of the Lord's Prayer, or some of the words, became, "Give us this day our daily harbour seal." I have to finish. From the outset, I knew that I wanted to present these lectures as a narrative with a spatial and temporal thread insofar as the subject matter allowed. I did this not because I thought that this audience could not handle a healthy dose of theory, concepts, detail and specialist information, and I know you were desperate to see more and bigger pollen diagrams. But I wanted to impart something of the excitement that this research has given to me. My intention has been to provide sufficient context from the work of our research groups to then permit me, along the way, the indulgence of diving into findings which I've found interesting and that I hope have interested you also. Little of this would have been possible without the partnership, friendship and generosity of my research colleagues, and this is very much a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary and international endeavour. The Vikings, the Norse, have a hold on the popular imagination, just as their descendants have maintained a cultural, if not always proprietorial hold on many of the North Atlantic areas to which they migrated. What they show, to paraphrase the words of Eric Linklater, is that it is possible for a people with an indomitable spirit to make a fair haven on the windy edge of nothing. And with regard to the Norse in Greenland, rather than seeing a society experiencing collapse, which it may have been in part, I tend to the views articulated variously by Kirsten Seaver, the historian, and the paleoanthropologist Niels Linnerup, scholars who've actually thought about the topic as opposed to jumping for one or other deterministic explanation. That the Norse saw Greenland as an extension to the fjords, whether they be Icelandic, Norwegian, or even Shetlandic, simply on an individual basis perhaps, but I think it was probably an orderly withdrawal, albeit over decades. There is no evidence that they would have seen this as a failure, but rather an accommodation to prevailing environmental, social and economic conditions. What the Hiberno-British slaves thought of this might be another matter altogether. I said at the outset of this series of lectures that I had a fear of lecturing to an audience of one by the time of the end of this lecture. I found the presence of a full house throughout the series a tremendous support, and I thank you warmly for staying the course. I'm grateful and touched that the Society of Antiquaries has accorded me the great privilege and honour of addressing you as its Rhind's lecturer. Thank you.